Have you ever thought about how cool it is that, our bodies just know how to fight off all the, nasty little things that are trying to make us sick?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty amazing system when you think about it.
Yeah. So today we're going to dive deep into, all the ways plants and animals, us included, of course, are constantly battling it out with microorganisms.
That's right. And we'll be drawing specifically from the material you sent, which is that PDF document called Microorganisms and Immunity by Mr. Chi.
Right, right. And, our mission here really is to, pull out the most important nuggets of understanding about how all these different organisms protect themselves. We want to find out who the key players are, and maybe even get a sense of how we can give our own immune systems a little boost.
I think we'll uncover some fascinating stuff for sure. Ready to dive in?
I'm ready if you are. Let's do it.
All right. So first things first, we've got to define what we're talking about here. What exactly is immunity?
Okay, good point. We should lay the groundwork. So, according to the document, immunity basically boils down to how a plant or an animal fights off infection. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, makes sense. But of course, the way a plant does it is going to be very different from how an animal does it. I mean, plants can't exactly just run away, right?
Now, they're kind of stuck where they are. So, what's their first line of defense? If a plant can't escape, how does it keep those microbes at bay?
Well, it all starts with, think of it like physical barriers. The document mentions things like a waxy cuticle on leaves and stems. It's like a waterproof shield, you know?
Oh yeah, like a raincoat for a plant.
Exactly. Then you've got bark on trees, which is obviously a super tough outer layer. And then there's the way their epidermal cells are packed together really tight. It makes it really hard for anything to squeeze in between.
It's like they built their own little fortress.
Exactly. They've got to keep those invaders out. But of course, even the best defenses can be breached. What happens if a rose bush gets pricked by a thorn?
Oh, right. So something breaks through that outer layer. Then what?
Well, the plant has another trick up its sleeve. It can produce these sticky substances like gums and resins. Think of it like a natural bandage that seals the wound. It also helps to physically block anything from getting in.
That's pretty cool. It's like their own little first aid kit. But let's say a pathogen actually gets inside and starts causing an infection.
Yeah.
Do plants have a way to fight back actively?
They do. Once an infection takes hold, they kickstart what the document calls their natural immune response. It's fascinating, really. They release certain chemical compounds, like salicylic acid.
Wait, salicylic acid, isn't that related to aspirin?
You got it. And in plants, it acts as a signal, an alarm bell, if you will. It gets transported throughout the plant through these channels called phloem and reaches cells that haven't even been infected yet. It's like, hey, everyone, heads up, we're under attack.
So it's like a plant-wide warning system.
Precisely. This early warning prompts those healthy cells to start producing their own chemical defenses. It's a pretty sophisticated strategy, even without antibodies like us.
Amazing how they've evolved these intricate defense mechanisms. But what about us, the animal kingdom? How do we hold our own against these microbial invaders?
Well, in animals, and that includes us humans, we've got a more complex system at play. We've got two main branches of immunity. First, there's natural immunity, which is what we're born with. It's our built-in, always-on protection.
Okay, so that's like our first line of defense. And what does that involve? What are some of the key players?
Think of it like your body having multiple checkpoints to keep those invaders out. First and foremost, we've got our skin, which is a fantastic multi-layered barrier. Then you've got tears, which, aren't just for crying. They actually have antiseptic properties that can wash away microbes. And then there's the mucus in our air passages, which traps invaders before they can reach the lungs.
Mucus, huh? Not the most glamorous thing, but definitely important.
Mm-hmm.
What else is part of this initial defense system?
Oh, we've got more. There's lysozyme in saliva, which is an enzyme that can break down bacterial cell walls. Earwax, as gross as it might seem, is actually trapping foreign particles. And then, of course, we've got the heavy artillery down in the stomach, hydrochloric acid, and a whole bunch of enzymes that create a really harsh environment that most pathogens just can't handle.
It's like a microscopic obstacle course for those little buggers.
Pretty much. But, let's face it, sometimes those defenses get breached and some pathogens manage to sneak in. That's when our second line of defense comes into play.
Right, so this is where things get more targeted and specific. What happens when those invaders manage to get past those initial barriers?
Okay, so according to the document, once those pathogens are inside, there are two main responses. First, you've got what's called the primary response, which is like the immediate, non-specific reaction. It's all about containing the threat and preventing it from spreading further. This is where you get inflammation, that's swelling and redness around a wound. And then there's fever, which is basically raising your body temperature to try to inhibit the growth of those pathogens.
So it's like the body's sounding the alarm and trying to control the situation as quickly as possible. But what about the secondary response? That sounds like where the real immune system memory and targeting come into play.
Exactly. The secondary response is where the adaptive or acquired immune system really gets going. It has two main goals: to eliminate those specific invaders, and then, crucially, to create a memory of them. That way, if the same pathogen shows up again, the body's ready to mount a much faster and more effective response.
So it's like our body learns from its encounters with these pathogens.
Exactly. And the heroes of the story are our white blood cells. The document specifically mentions two main groups: lymphocytes and phagocytes. You'll find these cells strategically stationed throughout your body, in the tonsils, lymph nodes, spleen, and circulating in the bloodstream.
Lymphocytes and phagocytes. Okay, got it. Let's start with lymphocytes. The document mentions two types: B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. What's the main difference between these two?
Well, the B lymphocytes are the antibody factories. You see, pathogens have these unique proteins on their surfaces called antigens. Think of them like little ID badges, each one specific to a particular type of microbe. There's a great diagram in the document, figure 27, that illustrates this. The B lymphocytes have receptors that can recognize these antigens.
Okay, so they can spot the bad guys by their ID badges. What happens when a B lymphocyte finds a match?
That's when they spring into action and start producing antibodies. Antibodies are these specialized proteins designed to target that specific antigen. They basically latch onto the pathogen and either disable it directly or mark it for destruction. Figure 27 also shows the four main ways antibodies deal with germs. They can cause bacterial cells to burst, they can act like sticky flags so phagocytes can easily find them, they can make pathogens clump together, and they can neutralize the toxins that some bacteria release. They're pretty amazing.
So they're like tiny little warriors with a whole arsenal of weapons.
That's a great way to put it. They are highly specialized and incredibly effective. Now, the document does mention something here that we should clarify. It says this rapid response, thanks to those B lymphocytes, is known as natural immunity.
Right, I noticed that too. Didn't we already talk about natural immunity? Isn't that what we're born with?
You're absolutely right. And to be completely accurate, the rapid response upon re-exposure is more commonly referred to as immunological memory, which is a hallmark of acquired immunity. Natural immunity, as we defined it earlier, is that inherent defense system we have from birth. So it seems like the document is using the term natural immunity in two slightly different contexts here.
Okay, that's a good distinction to make. It's always important to be clear about what these terms actually mean. So that's the B lymphocytes and their antibody superpowers. What about the T lymphocytes? What role do they play in this immune system saga?
T lymphocytes, which mostly hang out in the lymph nodes, are more like the direct combatants. There are two main types: CD4 cells, also known as helper T cells, and killer T cells. The helper T cells are like the coordinators of the immune response. They release signals that activate other immune cells, including those B cells to make more antibodies, and the killer T cells to, well, do their killing.
So the helper T cells are kind of like the generals directing the battle, and the killer T cells are, I guess, the special forces.
That's a great analogy. They're responsible for destroying cells in our body that have already been infected. You see, when a virus gets inside a cell, it basically takes over and starts making more copies of itself. The killer T cells can recognize these infected cells and eliminate them, which prevents the virus from spreading further.
So B cells target the free-floating pathogens with antibodies, and killer T cells go after our own compromised cells.
Wow.
Got it. Now, what about those other key players, the phagocytes?
Ah, the phagocytes. These guys are the engulfers, the cleanup crew. The document specifically mentions macrophages as a type of phagocyte. And the process they use is called phagocytosis, which literally means cell eating.
Cell eating, that sounds kind of intense.
It is. These macrophages can identify bacteria or other foreign particles, and they have these arm-like extensions called pseudopodia, meaning false feet, that reach out and surround the microbe, eventually engulfing it entirely.
So they basically trap it inside themselves. What happens next?
Well, once the bacteria is trapped inside this little bubble, it fuses with another compartment inside the macrophage called a lysosome. Think of lysosomes as the stomach of the cell. They contain powerful digestive enzymes that break down the bacteria, essentially dissolving it. The document actually links to a video showing this process. It's really cool to watch this microscopic Pac-Man in action.
Wow, so that's happening inside us all the time, without us even knowing it. Our bodies are pretty amazing. But sometimes, even with all these defenses, we need a little extra help, right? And that's where vaccinations come in.
Exactly. Vaccines are a way to give our immune systems a head start. The document defines them as a suspension of either dead or weakened microorganisms, or even just fragments of them, or their toxins. The key is that they contain enough of the pathogen signature to trigger immune response without actually causing the full-blown disease.
So it's like showing our immune system a wanted poster of the bad guy so it knows what to look for and how to fight it, but without actually getting into a full-blown fight.
Perfect analogy. Vaccination, or immunization as it's also called, is the process of administering this vaccine, usually through an injection or sometimes orally. The antibodies that our body produces in response to the vaccine then hang out in the bloodstream, providing long-lasting protection. This is what we call artificially acquired active immunity. It's active because our body is making the antibodies, but the exposure is artificial through the vaccine.
Right. And the document gives some common examples, like the MMR vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella. It's pretty incredible how much vaccinations have done to protect public health. There's also a link to a video explaining how vaccines work, which I'm sure would be super helpful for anyone who wants to learn more.
Definitely. Now, even with our natural defenses and the protection we get from vaccines, we can still sometimes get sick, especially with bacterial infections. That's where antibiotics come in.
Ah, yes, antibiotics. They're the go-to for bacterial infections. But it's important to remember, as the document emphasizes, that they don't work against viruses. Viruses are a whole different beast, and they require different treatment strategies.
That's a crucial point. The document highlights penicillin as the classic example of an antibiotic. It's produced by the Penicillium fungus, and it was discovered, rather serendipitously, by Alexander Fleming back in 1929. Talk about a medical revolution.
It totally changed the game. So how do antibiotics actually work? The document mentions they interfere with essential processes in bacteria. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. Different antibiotics target different aspects of bacterial biology. Some prevent them from building their cell walls, which are crucial for their survival. Others damage their cell membranes, messing with their structural integrity. And some interfere with protein synthesis, which basically shuts down all their cellular functions. It's like attacking their weak points.
Makes sense. It's like disabling them from the inside out. The document also really stresses the importance of completing the full course of antibiotics, even if you start feeling better before you finish all the pills. Why is that so important?
That's about preventing antibiotic resistance, which is a huge and growing problem. When you take antibiotics, the weaker bacteria are killed off first. But if you stop taking them too early, the tougher bacteria that survived might have picked up some genetic tricks that make them resistant to that antibiotic. And if those resistant bacteria multiply, well, the next time you get infected, those antibiotics might not work as well or at all.
That's scary. It's like we're inadvertently training these bacteria to become superbugs.
You got it. It's like an arms race, and we need to be smart about how we use these powerful weapons. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about how we can actually use microorganisms to our advantage through biotechnology.
Oh yeah, that's the other side of the coin. It's not all about fighting them off. We can actually harness their power for good.
Exactly. Biotechnology is simply the use of microorganisms to make stuff that's useful to us. And it's amazing how many applications there are. We're talking about medicines like antibiotics and insulin, and even foods like maize, bread, wine, and cheese.
It really is mind-blowing how these tiny, often invisible organisms play such a huge role in our lives. Let's start with making antibiotics. We already talked about penicillin, so let's use that as an example.
So natural antibiotics like penicillin are made by certain fungi, like that penicillium mold we talked about. To produce it on a large scale, they basically grow the mold in these huge tanks under controlled conditions with all the nutrients it needs. After a few days, they extract the penicillin and purify it.
So it's like brewing beer, but instead of beer, we're making a life-saving drug. Pretty cool. Another amazing application of biotechnology is the production of insulin, which has been a game changer for people with diabetes.
Absolutely. The pancreas normally makes insulin, which is a hormone that regulates blood sugar levels. But people with diabetes either don't make enough insulin or their bodies can't use it properly. They often need to inject insulin regularly to manage their condition. And the amazing thing is, we can actually use bacteria to make human insulin.
Wait, bacteria making human insulin? How does that even work?
It's pretty ingenious. Scientists can genetically engineer bacteria, usually E. coli, to produce human insulin. Think of it like this. Bacteria have these little rings of DNA called plasmids. Scientists can essentially cut these plasmids open, insert the human gene for insulin into them, and then put these modified plasmids back into the bacteria.
So they're basically giving the bacteria new instructions.
Exactly. And when these modified bacteria are grown in big tanks, they follow those new instructions and start producing human insulin. Then the insulin is extracted and purified for use as medicine. Figure 30 in the document shows the whole process visually.
That is incredible. Turning bacteria into tiny insulin factory, it's really a testament to the power of our understanding of biology. But humans have been using microorganisms for centuries, long before we even knew what they were. The document talks about traditional technologies that utilize them, especially in food production.
Oh, absolutely. For millennia, we've been unknowingly harnessing the power of these tiny organisms to make all sorts of delicious things. It all comes down to fermentation. The document explains that yeast, when there's no oxygen around, can convert sugar into alcohol, carbon dioxide, and a bit of energy. This process is behind so many of our favorite things.
Like beer.
Yeah.
I mean, who doesn't love a good beer?
Well, beer is made from grains like barley, wheat, or rice, along with hops for flavor, and yeast is added to the mix. During fermentation, the yeast eats the sugars from the grains and produces alcohol and carbon dioxide, which gives beer its characteristic fizz.
Cheers to that. What about wine?
Wine is typically made from grapes, and the document points out that the yeasts that naturally live on grape skins are often the ones responsible for fermentation. They convert the sugar in the grapes into alcohol.
That's like nature's own little winemakers. And then there's bread. I can't even imagine life without bread.
Yeast is the key to making most types of bread rise. During fermentation, the yeast produces carbon dioxide gas, which creates all those little air pockets in the dough, making it light and fluffy.
So the yeast is doing all the heavy lifting before the bread even goes into the oven. Amazing. What about cheese? That's another food where microorganisms play a crucial role.
Cheese making relies on bacteria, often types of lactobacillus. They ferment the lactose, the sugar in milk, and produce lactic acid. This causes the milk to curdle, separating into solids, the curds, and liquid, the whey. The curds are then pressed and aged to create all the different kinds of cheese we love.
So from plain milk to a whole world of cheese, all thanks to bacteria. And finally, the document mentions Moz, which is a fermented milk product, right?
Yes, Moz is similar to yogurt. It's made by fermenting milk with bacteria, which produces lactic acid. This lactic acid thickens the milk and gives it that tangy flavor, and it also acts as a preservative.
It's incredible how diverse and impactful these microorganisms are. From fighting off infections to making life-saving medicines and creating some of our favorite foods and drinks, they're truly essential to our world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And so we've reached the end of our deep dive into microorganisms and immunity. We've explored how plants and animals defend themselves. We've delved into the complexities of the human immune system, and we've seen how microorganisms can be both a threat and a valuable resource.
It's been a wild ride, and definitely full of those aha moments we were hoping for. It's especially fascinating to see the contrast between the simple but effective defenses of plants and the intricate targeted immune responses in animals. And it's pretty amazing to think that so much of our lives, from our health to the food we eat, relies on these tiny organisms.
Indeed. And this exploration leads us to a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder. Given this intricate relationship between us and the microbial world, what new strategies might we discover for preventing and treating infections, especially with the growing threat of antibiotic resistance? Or how can we use our understanding of plant immunity to develop new and sustainable agricultural practices? The possibilities are vast.
Those are some really interesting questions to consider. It definitely makes you appreciate the complexity and interconnectedness of life on Earth. Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this deep dive. It's been an enlightening journey.
My pleasure. And thanks to you, our listener, for joining us. Until next time, keep exploring the fascinating world around you.